Welcome, everyone, to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. Tonight, we start the second book of Shmuel. Last week, we finished Shmuel Aleph, and tonight we start Shmuel Bet. Shmuel Aleph ended with the death of King Saul, his sons, especially Yehonatan, who was very close to David, and the Philistines took his body and hung it from the walls of Beit Shan, yes, and Mount Gilboa, and the people of Benjamin risked their lives, and they redeemed the body of Shaul. They were able to recapture it, and take it for proper burial.
Beit Shan was hit yesterday.
Okay, continuing. So this is where the second book of Shmuel opens up, and that is that David wasn't at this battle. If you remember, it's a long story. People can get the recording from last week. But David, who had been hiding out with the Philistines, when the Philistines attacked King Shaul, David was not there. And so at this point, he doesn't know what happened. And so he is in Ziklag. That's where David and his family and his 600 men were holed up or stationed. And someone came all disheveled with his clothes ripped and mud on his head. And he came and he asked to talk to David. And he was the one who told David that Shaul had been killed and that his sons and Yehonatan had been killed. And when David heard this, so he said, "How do you know?" He said, "Well, I was there. And what happened was, I just happened to be near Shaul HaMelech, and he had been very injured. And he turned to me and he said," he was like in the process of dying. At least this person thought so. And he said, Shaul HaMelech said to him, "Please take your sword and finish me off, because I'm at the end, and I don't want the Philistines to capture me alive." So this man said, "I saw that he was not going to live, and so I did what he asked, and I killed him." Now we should take notice that in the end of Shmuel Aleph, it describes the death of Shaul, and it does not mention this person at all. So there is a question who this person was, and was he telling the truth? We know that Shaul died, that we know. And we know that according to the first account, Shaul himself fell on his sword. He was in the throes of death, and he felt it would have been a desecration of God's name that the king would be captured by the Philistines. And so he fell on his sword. But here, this person has a whole different story. So the story continues that David, when he heard this, he rent his clothes, what's called kriya. And this is one of the sources that when we hear of someone dying, usually it's the 7 close relatives: father, mother, brother, sister, spouse, or son, daughter. Here, Shaul was his father-in-law, but there's also a custom that when a great person dies, then it's permissible to rent your clothes. So it says that David and everyone with him, they rent their clothes, they fasted, they mourned, they wept for the whole day. And this again is proof of what we've been saying all along, that David never meant Shaul harm, even though he was anointed in secret by Shmuel. God made it clear that he has taken away the throne and the kingship from Shaul HaMelech. Nonetheless, we saw consistently David avoided hurting Shaul, even though he had the chance many times to kill him. And in fact, his soldiers almost begged him to kill Shaul while he had the chance, and he would not do it. Each time he would talk to Shaul and say, I could have just killed you. I'm trying to show you I have mean you no harm. And David was dedicated to Shaul. And even though it was clear that he would be the next king, he would not do anything to make that happen. In other words, he basically, God, if you want to make me king, you're going to have to arrange it, because I'm not going to lift a finger against what he called Mashiach Hashem, the anointed of God. So after they rent their clothes, they mourn, they fast. So David talked to this person again, and the person brought the crown of the king and his bracelet to show David that what I'm telling is the truth. Now, no one was there to see if he was actually the one who killed him, but he did have the crown and the bracelet, and he admitted to killing Shaul. And so David had him killed. He said, how did you have the nerve to take the life of the anointed of God? And it turns out that this person was from Amalek. And what somehow he must have been in the camp of the Philistines. And then when he saw Shaul, he decided he would take the crown. It's really not clear what he was doing there, but he admitted that he was from Amalek. So afterwards, starting in the 17th verse of the first chapter of Shmuel Bet, David laments the death of Shaul and his sons, and especially Yehonatan. And here that the language is, Bekonen David et hakina hazot al Shaul ve'al Yehonatan bano, that he lamented with this lamentation for Shaul and his son Yehonatan. Now, what is significant about this is on Tisha B'Av, we read a whole series of what are called kinot, from the same word here of lamentations. On Tisha B'Av, we spend almost a whole morning reading these very, very sad, very descriptive of the terrible slaughter that happened in the destruction of the temples. And over the years, kinot were added. And even in most books for Tisha B'Av, there's now a number of keynote for the Holocaust. There's a keynote for the Crusades. And so over literally thousands of years. But what's significant here is, in a certain way, when you read through this lamentation, the tone of it, the language of it, really led the way for all subsequent keynote. And especially this is approximately 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. What's considered in a certain way the most ancient of the keynote that we say on Tisha B'Av was written by Jeremiah, for the king Yoshiyahu. And I believe last week we actually discussed the whole story of King Yoshiyahu. It's an amazing story. People are invited to see the recording from last week. But that was like close to 500 years later. So this lamentation by David, we're not going to go through it word by word, but for those who want to, it begins on the 17th verse, and it goes all the way to chapter 2. And again, the language is really, in a certain way, set the tone for future keynote. Just like David's Psalms paved the way for Hebrew poetry throughout the generations. But part of it is the following, where it says, and I'll read it in English. O Yehonatan, slain in thy high places, I am distressed for thee, my brother Yehonatan. Very dear hast thou been to me. Thy love to me was wonderful, more than the love of women. How are the mighty fallen? So here, I'm going to digress a little bit. And I realize that in modern culture, this is a very sensitive subject. But I want to be clear, because this description by David, that his love between him and Yehonatan was more precious than the love of women. So very unfortunately, in modern times, people have taken modern culture, modern ways that people behave, and have reinterpreted this as if David and Yehonatan had a homosexual relationship. This flies in the face of all Jewish tradition. And the fact that David would say such a thing in such an innocent and a pure way, knowing that in Jewish law, homosexual relationships are not approved of. That's why I don't want to get into the state of the world right now. But here, the fact that David, knowing that, had no shame or no inhibition to express how deep the love between he and Yehonatan was. In Pirkei Avot, their love is used as the example of a type of love that is not dependent on anything. And if we look at relationships, love relationships between men and women, no matter how deep the love is, there, in a certain way, it is dependent on certain things, especially in a marriage relationship in Judaism. Intimate relations are very positive. It's a very, very important part of Jewish marriage relationships. And so in a certain way, it is dependent on certain things. In a marriage, men depend on their wives for certain things. Wives depend on their husbands for certain things. So even though it could be a very pure love, it's dependent on something. But here, the example of a love that was not dependent on anything, and that in a way nullifies that even the thought that there was any sexual connection in this relationship. And it went to such a degree that Yehonatan, he was supposed to be the next king. He was in line to be the next king. And that's why his father was so upset at him, that Yehonatan understood that David is meant to be king, not me. And so in a certain way, he sacrificed everything. But in the end, I want to say Yehonatan died with his father. In other words, his love of David, even though his father was furious at him, it never nullified his love and respect and loyalty and honor that he gave to his father. And so he literally died with him in showing his loyalty. So I just wanted to mention that, because here we see just such an innocent, pure statement of love between two people. And I'll mention that in one of the books that Rav Ginsburg wrote, it's in Hebrew. The English version has never come out. Years ago, I actually helped prepare it. It just hasn't come to light yet. But it's based on the idea that there are 13 different types of love relationships between God and Israel, between Israel and God, between teachers and students, between students and teachers, between husbands and wives, wives and husbands, brothers and sisters, sisters and brothers, friends, between the king and the people and the people and the king. It comes to 13 different relationships. Sometimes when we hear about love relationships, we think almost exclusively of men and women relationships. But there are many, many types of love relationships, and many of them are like David and Yehonatan. They're absolutely pure relationships, not dependent on anything. So that was just an important statement. Now we go to chapter 2. And after this, we see in a series of times, we have to remember that the son of the priest of Nov, that Shaul killed the whole city, was Eviatar. And he came with the Urim and Tumim, the way, we'll call it the oracle that the high priest would wear, and only questions of great import could be asked of the Urim and the Tumim. So David, after this whole thing, is like, in a certain way, he's set up now to be king. And so he asked the Urim and Tumim, should I go up to Yehuda? And he was told, yes, go to Yehuda. And he goes at that point with his two wives. And it says there, the tribe of Yehuda anointed David as king over their tribe. Now, this needs some comment, because at this point, he's not king of all of Israel, as we're going to see in 1 minute. But the tribe of Yehuda anointed him as king. He becomes king of Yehuda. And we have to realize that at that point of Jewish history, the tribes were very, very independent and very clannish. And they had their portion in the land. They had their customs. They had their extended families. And it was very much like an extended family, each of the tribes. It was David, as we're going to be learning in Shmuel Bet, he was the one who really brought all of the tribes together in a way that the national identity became, in a certain way, even more important than the tribal identity. And so right after this, the story continues. And first of all, David sends a message to the people of Yavesh Gilad. These are the people who risked their lives to get the body of Shaul and give it a proper burial in the tribe of Benjamin. Remember, Shaul was from Benjamin. And he sends them like a blessing. Like, what you did was such a right thing. And I applaud you for it. In a certain way, remember the first king was from Benjamin. So in a certain way, David was kind of sending like a peace offering. And then he mentions, by the way, the tribe of Yehuda have anointed me king over them. In a certain way, hinting that he is now, he had many chances to kill Shaul, and he wouldn't, but now his time has come. In a certain way, that was the message he sent. But then the story continues, and we find out that Shaul and 3 of his sons were killed in battle, but he had another son, and his name was Ish-Boshet. You could call it a man of great humbleness. And he was, as we're going to see, he wasn't a very strong figure. But who sets him up was the general of Shaul, who either survived the battle with the Philistines or for some reason wasn't there, but he's still alive. So Avner takes the son of Shaul and he anoints him as king over the rest of Israel. So now here we have, we'll call it a problem. David is now king of Yehuda, and Avner, who is a very, very strong personality, he sets up Ish-Boshet to be the king of Israel. And here, for the first time, it mentions that David was king in Hebron. Hebron is in Yehuda for 7.5 years. Ish-Boshet, it just mentions it here. Ish-Boshet, in the end, only ruled for 2 years. And what happened is the following, is that we have a conflict here. It's as if we have 2 kings. Now, this is before there was a division between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, but here already we see the roots of it. There are now 2 kings in Israel. And so the general of Ish-Boshet, he and his men meet Yoav. Yoav is David's general. And they happen to have met in a place by like a pool. And it was in the pool of Givon. And things got out of hand, and they ended up battling each other, and it turned into a major battle. And the forces of Yoav were victorious. So Avner is kind of like running away with his men. And it says that Yoav, so he had 2 brothers. Avishav and Asael. Remember, Yoav is the general who has now defeated Avner, at least in this skirmish, this battle. The Asael, his brother, so the text describes him as being as swift as a deer. And he chased after Avner, and he kind of cornered him. And Avner says, let's just end this right now. Just go away, leave me alone. Let's just call this a day. And Asael would not listen. Asael was going to kill him. And so Avner did try to get Asael to back off, and Asael would not. And so Avner kills Asael. And then Yoav is now chasing Avner. And he realizes Avner had just killed his brother. And Avner at a certain point says, let's stop this now before everyone gets killed. And Yoav listened to him. And Yoav backed off, and they went their ways. But here we see the seeds of later will become the split of the kingdoms here. And the third chapter begins by saying there was a long period of warfare between the house of Shaul and the house of David. But David became stronger and stronger day by day, and the house of Shaul became weaker and weaker, because Ishbosheth was, Avner set him up in a certain way as a figurehead. He didn't really have kingly attributes. But since he was the king of Shaul, he's set up as king. So what happens next is apparently Shaul had a concubine. Remember, in those days, there was call it a full marriage and a 3/4 kind of marriage. We don't have that today, and it may sound a little bit foreign to us, but that's how it was done in those days. And so the king, Shaul, had a concubine. He's now dead. And Avner wants to be with his concubine. In fact, he is. And Ishbosheth, this is in a certain way a credit to Ishbosheth. In a certain way, he knows that he's dependent on Avner for his power. And yet he's really outraged that Avner would take the concubine, we'll call it even the wife of Shaul. He just felt that was wrong. And he confronted Avner. And as I said, Avner was a very, very strong personality. And he became very insulted, extremely insulted. And he even tells Ishbosheth, I'm the power behind the throne. I'm going to put my power behind David. And so what happens is Avner sends a message to David and says, it's very important that he says that he accepts that David really is meant to be the next king. In other words, even though David was anointed in private, the word has gotten out. And we have to remember that one of the reasons that Shaul became so jealous of David, that David was the greatest warrior in Israel, not just when he killed Goliath, in many, many different battles. And this we learned already, that he became more famous than Shaul, and Shaul became very jealous and then realized that this was a setup for David to become king, even though we saw and discussed it right here many times that David refused to take that step. And here, a very interesting thing happens is that David sends back to Avner and says, you can come and meet with me, but I want you to send back my first wife, Michal. Now, if you remember, Shaul had taken Michal and married her to another man. Whole question, like, how did that happen? Because she was still married to David. And we already learned that this new husband understood that there's something like not kosher here. And he never was with her intimately. And so they never really consummated the marriage. And so it wasn't a full marriage in that sense. And so Avner sends away this husband. And the story doesn't really tell what happens afterwards, and brings Michal back to David, but she, at least in the next few chapters, she's not even mentioned. So we'll have to see how that develops. So Avner then goes to the elders of the tribes, and he says, it's clear to me that Hashem has chosen David to be king over all of Israel. In other words, he abandoned Ishbosheth. Whether he used this excuse that he was insulted, that Ishbosheth challenged his right to take the wife of Shaul, or it's something that would have happened anyways. But here, at least, the trigger was this whole incident. So Avner goes to see David, and David welcomes him and trusts him, and he takes him at his word. And Avner comes to David and says, I will deliver all of Israel into your hands. In other words, you're meant to be king. I'll make a covenant with you, and that is what's going to happen. And David agrees. He gives him great honor. And even though Avner, in a certain way, was a rival of his, but here he buries the hatchet and accepts Avner at his word. But what happens then is Avner is now going back, and he's going to make arrangements. He's going to talk to all the tribes. Everyone's going to come together and anoint David as king of all of Israel. So when Avner leaves, Yoav follows him. Now remember, Yoav is the general of David, and Avner has killed his brother. And so he goes after him, and he says, can we talk? And so Avner, because David, it was clear that David accepted him, and they made an arrangement. It even uses the word covenant. And Yoav kills Avner on the spot. And Avner just wasn't prepared. And Yoav kills him for killing his brother. When David hears this, he was outraged. And he again, almost like Shaul, he rends his clothes, he mourns, and he actually, it's interesting, he curses Yoav, because Yoav acted on his own, and David had no part of this. And so then the text describes that David went out of his way to try to show all of Israel that he had nothing to do with this. He had nothing to do with this. And apparently, people accepted this. people accepted this. And like I said, David goes out of his way to mourn publicly Avner and makes the point, and it is accepted. So then what happens is that Avner is now dead. Ishbosheth is still technically king. So Avner's whole plan of delivering all of Israel into David's domain didn't happen. So now the text in the 4th chapter describes that there actually was a son of Yehonatan, and that he was lame when this child was 5 years old. When the news came that Shaul and his father Yehonatan had been killed, the nurse tried to flee because she didn't know if the Philistines were coming. She didn't know what would be, and she dropped him, and he was injured, and he was called Mipi Boshet, just like his it would be his uncle. I'm thinking out loud. No. It was Shaul's son, and this is Yonatan's son. So you'll pardon me, but I can't remember what their relationship would be. Anyways, you'll forgive me. And so what happens now is that Ishbosheth had 2 other generals named Baana and Rechav. And they saw what was happening here. They saw that Avner really had given up on Ishbosheth. Everyone started to see that David was meant to be king. And so what they did, they went and they killed Ishbosheth, and they cut off his head, and they brought it to David in Hebron. They thought David would be like, oh, great job. Again, David had nothing to do with this. And they thought, okay, like it's obviously David's going to be king. Someone's got to get rid of Ishbosheth. They thought they had done something really good. David, again, was outraged. And he had both of them killed because they had killed Ishbosheth. And again, he mourns Ishbosheth. He makes a point to all of Israel that he had nothing to do with this. But the momentum was now in David's favor. So at the beginning of chapter 5, so the elders of Israel, we imagine representatives of all the different tribes, they come to David in Hebron, and they anoint him king over all of Israel. So this is a watershed in Jewish history. David now is king over all of Israel. And so here it mentions, again, it's looking into the future, but it says that David was 30 years old when he began to reign in Hebron. Now remember, it says already that he reigned for 7.5 years in Hebron. And the text continues, and he ruled in Yerushalayim for 33 years. So altogether, he reigned for 40 years, and actually 40 and a half years. But because it was a half a year, the text just says 40 years. So he reigned in Hebron for 7.5 years. Even when he became king of all of Israel, he still kept his headquarters, we'll call it, in Hebron. And then in the continuation of chapter 5, here David goes up to Yerushalayim. And here it actually says he goes up to Sion and the city of David. And to this day, there is what's called Har Sion and Ir David. Ir David was the original Yerushalayim, and it was below where the Temple Mount is. And so here it describes how David now is, in a certain way, moving his headquarters to Jerusalem. Jerusalem had not been conquered to that point. And so David is the one who actually conquers Jerusalem, and he sets up his kingship in the city of David on Sion. This is really it's like the most important mentioning of Sion, of Zion. Zionism is he set up his stronghold in Sion and Ir David. And it actually doesn't even mention the name Yerushalayim here. And then Hiram, the king of Tsur in Lebanon, he sees David's greatness, and he starts sending David cedar trees and carpenters and masons in order to make peace between them. And later, we're going to get to it, when Shlomo HaMelech builds the temple, it's Hiram who helps him with the same thing, with carpenters and especially the cedars of Lebanon. And chapter 5 ends with one second. Actually, I want to just go back for a minute, back to when David was in Hebron, going back to the 3rd chapter, where it talks about the sons born to David when he was in Hebron. And at this point, he has 2 wives, and now it mentions a 3rd wife. Up to now, it didn't mention when he married this 3rd wife, but a 3rd wife is mentioned. And so his firstborn, now these names are going to come back to us in the continuation of the story. That's why I wanted to mention it here. Here's where they're first mentioned, that his firstborn was Amnon, and he was born to Achinoam. And the second was Kilav, to Avigail. And then the 3rd was Avshalom. Avshalom is going to play a major part in the continuation of the story. And he was the son of Ma'akah. This is the 3rd wife that hasn't been mentioned when he actually married her. And then the 4th was Adoniah. Sometimes he's called Adoniyahu. He also is going to play a major part, and his mother was Chagit. So we know by tradition that David in his lifetime had 18 different wives. And up to now, we were only introduced to two of them, Achinoam and especially Avigail. There was a whole story. Avigail was married to Naval, and that whole story, which we're not going to go back into here. And so here, and then a couple more sons are mentioned. But here, Amnon is going to play a major part. Adoniyahu is going to play a major part, and Avshalom. So we're going to finish with the 5th chapter, where it actually says that David takes more wives, and then the Pelishtim, the Philistines, heard that David has been anointed. Now remember, David was the one who killed Goliath of the Philistines. And they come to what's called Emek Rephaim. Now it's interesting that in Yerushalayim today, one of the major streets is called Emek Rephaim. It doesn't mean that that's exactly where this place was, but it's named after this place, Emek Rephaim. And there, the Philistines gathered to fight Israel again. And this time, David again asked the Urim and Thummim, should I go to war? And the Urim and Thummim say yes, but they also tell him that he shouldn't meet them head on. He should do like a diversion, and he should only attack from behind. And so here it's mentioned that David does just that, and he was able to defeat the Philistines again. And that's how chapter 5 ends. So we will pick up on chapter 6 next week.